In a lovely review of research that was done in 2011 by Street Horn, she found that these events occur in people of all nationalities, ethnicities, religious affiliations. They're across the board. So income, ability, educational level, it doesn't matter. They can happen to anyone, and they do. And what we also know, because sometimes people ask this, well, is it happening only to people who have some sort of mental health issue? And that is not the case. These often happen in people who are free of any kind of mental illness. And so it's not only related to that. We do see that widows and widowers, at least in the literature, are especially likely to report these events. Again, that doesn't mean they're the only ones having it. They are just more likely to report it. And women more likely than men. So in the research I'm going to be describing, it's part of a larger program that I believe will be discussed later on by my lovely colleague, Evelyn Elsevier. And we looked at 12 different kinds of death communications. We asked people for information, and we were really very aware from the literature that there's a description of these 12 kinds. So the first 6 here, sensing a presence. This is the most common type of after-death communication, a sensation that someone is near, hearing a voice, feeling a touch, again, pretty powerful and common. Smelling a fragrance, so an aroma associated with that deceased loved one. Visual experiences, and so these can range from sort of a ephemeral type of appearance to a more solid form. And often, interestingly, they are reported as having happened at the evening, at nighttime, at the foot of the person's bed. Other visions, even full lifelike body appearances, which appear solid and real, can happen. Twilight experiences are quite common. So these experiences that we've been talking about happening during altered states of consciousness. So there are multiple ways of altering our consciousness, but they include things like when you're sort of on that sleep-wake cusp, awakening from sleep, or doing some other contemplative practice like meditating or praying. And then while you are actually asleep, having these sort of events happen, these communications. You can have them happen when you have an out-of-body experience that you make contact with the deceased, sort of more at their environment. Physical phenomena is another thing that might happen. So these might be your environment changing or being impacted, clocks stopping, lights going off and on, appliances turning themselves on, things being moved around. That all can be a communication from a loved one. Phone calls, interestingly, are reported. So these may occur while awake or asleep, and they're literally the phone ringing from and a call from the person who has passed on. And of course, we have quite common symbolic after-death communications. These are signs from the loved one. So this often can take the form of a particular animal, a bird, or some other meaningful type of animal coming to visit, visitations from these butterflies, specific things like coins turning up, or anything meaningful for the deceased that is then occurring in your life in a way that's very meaningful and indicative of a communication. So these are some of the things we asked about in our work of researching this. As I said, this was part of a large international survey study that was a mixed method survey to describe the phenomenology of after-death communications. And we wanted to see who has ADCs, under what circumstances, just a lot more information about what are people experiencing. and also describing the impact of these after-death communications on the recipients. How do people make sense of this? What's the long-term effect, the short-term effect? Does it influence grieving? So these are the larger questions asked in this survey. And again, it was done online internationally, and interested parties were provided with information about it and could inform themselves about it and then decide to participate. We had ultimately 993 respondents from across the globe answering, believe it or not, 194 questions. So that's a lot of questions, some open, where they had sort of free range to respond as they wish, for instance, describing the experience of the after-death communication, and some much more like demographic or answering sort of questionnaires. So people were dedicated who took this survey. What I'm going to report on, and what my group had sort of agreed to look at, was the impact of the after-death communication on beliefs and spirituality, as well as attitudes about death and dying, and the factors that moderate these changes. So we're really looking at this sort of little smaller segment of all the data. And we really try to assess the changes before and after the reported after-death communication. So we asked questions about what they were like, their beliefs, their fears, their attitudes prior to the after-death communication and after. Now, this was, again, a one-time questionnaire, so we do have that limitation. This was not something where they actually answered the questions earlier and then had the experience and then could answer the questions later. They had to sort of try to recall their thoughts and emotions and attitudes prior and then after. And we looked at the changes and if there was anything that really seemed to be related to those changes in a meaningful way. What we saw is that, again, we had 993 people. So it was, I say worldwide, that's not really quite accurate. It was primarily North America, a bit of South America, and then Europe, and English, French, and Spanish speaking. As you see here, we had predominantly female participants who were quite well educated, and most of them in some sort of committed relationship. So a little bit different than some of the data you see that's coming from people who've lost a partner. We didn't have nearly as many of those. So getting to the information about what we found, that the after-death communication did not really change self-reported religiosity. So this was literally different than spirituality. This was defined more as participating in a structured and more formalized religion. And we didn't see real change in that from pre to post. We did see, however, significant changes in self-reported spirituality, more spiritual, changes in belief about life after death. And this was believing that life could extend, some sort of existence and survival happens after death. Those increased significantly after having the ADC. And changes in belief about deceased contacting the living. Again, this changed significantly. People believed that less prior to their after-death communication, and apparently with having an after-death communication, this had an impact on them to help them believe that this can happen. I can be contacted by the person who's passed on. So we see those as very significant there. And then what we wanted to look at is, okay, of these people that report these changes, what is it that might be moderating that? Is there something specific about them or their experience that makes that so? It's not just everyone, obviously, who had these significant changes. And so we looked at multiple potential moderating factors. So someone having multiple after-death communications, that might make a difference. Things like physical contact, or seeing, hearing, touching, smelling the deceased. Receiving a message might make a difference. What we saw here is, you see the percentage here, the number of observations of people who reported this, and then the percentage of this out of the overall. And you see that having multiple after-death communications was quite common. It was 80%. Feeling positive about it, down at the bottom, 91%. Quite positive, quite many people feeling that way. Knowing the deceased, the majority of people knew the deceased, and also received comfort, 73%. And received a message, about 60% or so received a message. Very interesting. And the summary of what we found, so as not to bog down in too many tables or statistics, because these are really interesting, and it's important to have a conversation about this, I believe. The majority of the participants in our study did endorse that their after-death communication was important or even life-changing. One of the quotes was, "I was comforted and it gave me hope that it wasn't just the end for him." And in reading through these, there were many, many sentiments like this of finding comfort and feeling that this was a very important event for them. Even when they had multiple ones, it was equally important. Only about 12% of the participants reported their experience as frightening. And 12 is still fairly high. So you do have to remember, some people experiencing these do find them discombobulating, frightening, and that is an important area to sort of look into. We did not do that in this study. I think that would be quite interesting, though, to find out what are the moderating effects, the moderating factors there for those folks. Is there anything affiliated with that experience of fear with an after-death communication? We saw also, to summarize, that the belief in life after death and the fact that the deceased can communicate with the living did significantly increase in participants after their reported after-death communication. And you can think about, well, that sort of makes sense. And yet we don't always see in research that things make sense. So this is comforting to see that it did have a cognitive restructuring component to it. It really did seem to help people sort of rethink what death is and isn't. And this is huge to me. This is really a very big factor, because often as a clinician, I'm searching for ways to help significantly shift the way someone is thinking about something, perceiving or interpreting something. And this kind of experience has that sort of strength, very comparable in my mind to a near-death experience or to a religious or mystical experience. I mean, it really has an impact that's quite profound and quite active in a short amount of time. It also has this impact of reducing fear of death in our participants. We saw significant reduction in fear of death and dying in our participants after having an after-death experience and communication. And this, again, to me as a clinician is quite profound, because we see the shift in thinking and restructuring of thought that then provides not only a new insight and way of thinking, but also this comfort that there is something more and bigger and beyond me that feels very comforting and helps me reduce this crippling fear of death. And that to me is a quite important impact that has many, many, many positive effects long-term. We saw, as you remember from the table, that after-death communications tend to be associated with increased spirituality beliefs, but not so much religiosity. So it appears that this, the way people define spirituality is more of a belief in this increased belief in a spiritual component to our life, not necessarily a regimented, organized religion. And then the participants who endorsed having an after-death communication with physical contact, so this is where we look at these moderating effects. If they had physical contact, they're more likely to endorse increased spirituality than participants who reported no physical contact. So again, very interesting. This physical contact seems to have an impact on this spirituality belief that that the spirits exist in beyond. And really, for religiosity, the only factor that appeared to be significantly associated with increased religiosity was having multiple after-death communications. And maybe we don't know as much about why that would be. Maybe for more of these more rigid or formulaic religions or conceptualizations of religions, the multiplicity of these after-death communications is what finally has an impact in changing that. So to summarize, the data so far is that we see that trying to touch the deceased, receiving a message from the deceased, or being contacted by the deceased were significant moderating factors in some of these beliefs in life after death and that happen after experiencing an after-death communication. So this physical touch, getting a message, or even being frightened, so having a real impact from the after-death communication seemed to really be a moderating factor in the belief in life after death. And trying to touch the deceased, being frightened by the contact, and perceiving the after-death communication as healing or comforting. So interesting. Again, it could be either a positive contact or a negative contact, but some sort of significant contact seem to be important, significant moderating factors in increased beliefs about the deceased being able to contact the living. So these, in my mind, make sense. I'd love to hear what other people think. You know, why would those things be important moderating factors? One thought that I had, and we present in the manuscript we wrote about this, is that perhaps our physical sensations inform our interpretation and impact our beliefs. So this is like the people that have to see it to believe it. And that physical sensation of being touched or having some sort of contact there, healing or fear, may impact how we interpret this after-death communication. And potentially the increased salience of these experiences might have an impact. Seeing a robin come land on the bush outside my window may have less salience to me than being touched on the shoulder and smelling the aroma of my mother's patchouli. And so we may be able to interpret that some of the salience of the experience has an impact and moderates the experiences. For instance, it may even just as straightforwardly as help us remember the event. You might forget the bird that landed on the bush and remember the aroma and the touch. And then of course it can impact how the salience impacts how we interpret and think about it as well.